There was a time in my life when nothing was technically wrong, but everything felt quietly heavy. I woke up, I worked, I spoke to people, I smiled when it was expected. And yet, beneath all of that, there was a constant sense that something inside me was slowly losing its voice. Not disappearing, just getting quieter. At first, I thought this was maturity. I told myself, this is just how adulthood feels. You don't expect too much anymore. You learn to be realistic. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true, because realism doesn't feel numb, and maturity doesn't feel empty. What I was experiencing was something else entirely. It was the gradual fading of my inner narration, that gentle voice that once commented on the world, that noticed small details, that felt curious without trying. I didn't lose it suddenly, so I misplaced it little by little. I stopped listening to myself in small, reasonable ways. I stayed quiet when I had something to say, because it felt inconvenient. I agreed when disagreement would have felt honest, but uncomfortable. I kept moving even when my body asked for rest, because stopping felt like falling behind. None of these choices felt dramatic. They felt practical, responsible, adult. And that's how it happens. You don't lose yourself in a crisis. You lose yourself in routines. You don't abandon your inner world in one bold decision. You trade it away for efficiency, for acceptance, for ease. Over time, life becomes smoother on the outside and thinner on the inside. I didn't notice the thinning at first, but I noticed the silence. Long walks felt shorter. Music felt flatter. Conversations felt scripted. I was present, but not inhabited. If you've ever felt this, you know how difficult it is to explain, because nothing is visibly broken. From the outside, your life looks fine. From the inside, it feels strangely unoccupied. I remember one evening in particular. I was sitting by a window, watching the light change color as the sun went down. It was a moment that should have felt peaceful, and yet there was nothing inside me responding to it. No emotion, no reflection, just observation. I wasn't sad. I wasn't anxious. I was empty in a quiet way. That emptiness scared me more than pain ever could. Pain speaks. Emptiness stays silent. And silence, when it lasts too long, starts to feel permanent. That night, I realized something important. I hadn't lost my inner voice. I had trained myself not to hear it. Every time I ignored a feeling because it was inconvenient. Every time I rushed past a thought because it slowed me down. Every time I chose productivity over presence. I was teaching myself that my inner world didn't deserve attention. And attention, once withdrawn for long enough, stops asking for itself. This is how people become disconnected without realizing it. Not through trauma, but through neglect, gentle neglect, the kind that looks harmless because it happens gradually. The next day, nothing changed on the surface. I still worked. I still spoke. I still functioned. But something had shifted internally. I began to notice how rarely I asked myself simple questions. How am I actually feeling? What do I need right now? What am I avoiding? These questions used to arise naturally. Now, they felt almost intrusive. As if checking in with myself was a disruption. That realization hurt, because it meant I had internalized the idea that my inner life was secondary, optional, something to return to when everything else was done. But everything else is never done. There is always another task, another expectation, another reason to postpone yourself. And so, days turn into months, months into years. You keep telling yourself, one day I'll slow down. One day I'll listen again. One day I'll feel like myself. But that day never schedules itself. It has to be chosen. I didn't make a dramatic decision. There was no turning point montage. What I did instead was something much smaller. I started leaving space, not productivity gaps, not planned breaks, but internal space. Moments where I didn't fill the silence with input, no music, no scrolling, no mental rehearsals, just quiet. At first, that quiet felt uncomfortable. My mind rushed to fill it. Thoughts appeared rapidly, like they were afraid of being ignored. But underneath that noise, something else waited. Something slower, something softer. It didn't speak immediately. It observed. Days passed, weeks passed, and gradually that inner voice began to return. Not loudly, not confidently, but honestly. It didn't offer grand insights. It pointed out small truths. You're tired. You don't actually enjoy this anymore. You miss being curious. You're moving too fast for your own understanding. These weren't accusations, they were acknowledgments, and acknowledging them didn't solve my life, but it made my life feel inhabited again. I began to feel texture returning. Moments regained depth. Silence stopped feeling empty. Slowness stopped feeling dangerous. I realized then that the inner voice isn't something you create. It's something you protect. It survives on permission. Permission to pause. Permission to feel without fixing. Permission to notice without optimizing. Most of us don't lack insight. We lack conditions. Our inner voice doesn't disappear because it has nothing to say. It disappears because it doesn't feel welcome, because it takes time, because it complicates things, because it doesn't fit neatly into schedules and metrics. So, we quiet it, not aggressively, just consistently. And then, one day, we wonder why life feels flat. Relearning how to listen is not about effort. It's about removal. Removing constant stimulation. Removing urgency where it isn't needed. Removing the belief that slowness equals failure. When I stopped rushing my inner world, it didn't suddenly become peaceful, but it became present. And presence, even when uncomfortable, is alive. I started noticing my reactions again. What drained me? What restored me? What conversations felt heavy, and which ones felt grounding? This awareness didn't demand action immediately. It asked for honesty first. Honesty is the first step toward gentler living, not changing everything, not escaping responsibilities, just living with internal consent, doing things because you choose to, not because you're numb enough to tolerate them. As my inner voice returned, I stopped trying to silence discomfort. I listened to it. Discomfort often carries information. It tells you where alignment is missing. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just makes it louder later. The voice I rediscovered was not dramatic. It didn't push me to reinvent my life. It didn't demand bold leaps. It asked for small adjustments, more rest, more truth, more space between commitments, less pretending, less rushing, less background noise. This gentleness surprised me. I had expected my inner voice to be demanding, critical, urgent. Instead, it was patient. It had been waiting, waiting for me to slow down enough to hear it. And that changed everything, not externally, but internally. Life didn't become easier, but it became mine again. And that, I learned, is where real gentleness begins. Not in comfort, but in listening. Listening changed the way my days unfolded. Not immediately, not dramatically, but subtly, in ways that were easy to miss if I wasn't paying attention. I began to notice how often modern life rewards disconnection, how speed is praised, how availability is expected, how silence is treated as something to be filled. Everywhere I went, there was noise competing for attention, not just sound, but urgency, messages that needed replies, updates that demanded reaction, opinions that insisted on being formed before reflection had time to arrive. It felt as if the world was constantly leaning forward, never allowing itself to fully sit. And I realized how easily I had absorbed that posture. Even when nothing was happening, my mind stayed slightly tense, as if waiting for the next interruption. That tension had become normal. I didn't notice it until moments of quiet made it visible. Quiet reveals what noise hides. When I allowed silence, I felt restless at first. My thoughts jumped quickly from one concern to another, like they were afraid they might be forgotten. I saw how trained I had become to avoid empty space. Empty space felt unproductive, unjustified, almost irresponsible. But beneath that conditioning, there was something else, a longing, not for escape, not for change, but for permission. Permission to exist without performing usefulness. I remembered being younger, before everything felt measured. Time used to stretch then. An afternoon could feel endless. A single conversation could occupy an entire day. I didn't need to document it. I didn't need to extract value from it. I simply lived inside it. Somewhere along the way, that way of inhabiting time was replaced. Time became segmented, optimized, broken into manageable units. And with that segmentation, experience lost its depth. Nothing stayed long enough to sink in. I began to understand that losing touch with yourself is not always about trauma or loss. Sometimes it's about acceleration, living too quickly to feel, responding too fast to reflect, moving on before meaning has time to form. Modern life doesn't ask us to abandon ourselves outright. It just keeps us busy enough that we don't notice we've drifted. Drift is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It happens in increments. You check your phone during a moment of boredom. You multitask during a conversation. You rush through a meal. You listen, but not fully. None of these moments feel important, but they accumulate. They create distance between you and your own experience. So I started paying attention to how often I left moments early. Not physically, but mentally. I would be somewhere, but already thinking about what came next. Even rest had become a transition, something to get through rather than something to inhabit. This habit made life feel thin, not unpleasant, just insubstantial, as if I was skimming the surface of my own days. I realized then that gentleness is not softness, it is presence. Gentleness asks you to stay, to resist the urge to rush forward when discomfort arises, to remain with a feeling long enough to understand it. Understanding takes time, and time, when given freely, changes everything. I began practicing small acts of staying with a thought instead of dismissing it, staying with a feeling instead of labeling it immediately, staying in a moment without reaching for something else. These were not practices anyone could see. They didn't produce visible results. But internally, something shifted. My reactions slowed. I noticed the gap between stimulus and response. That gap felt like space, and space felt like relief. In that space, I could choose. Not always wisely, not always calmly, but consciously. Conscious choice is a form of freedom. Most of our days are lived on autopilot. We respond based on habit, conditioning, expectation. Quiet listening interrupted that pattern. I started recognizing which choices were aligned and which ones were made out of avoidance. Avoidance is subtle. It disguises itself as efficiency, as practicality, as being realistic. But avoidance always feels rushed. It leaves a residue, a faint dissatisfaction that lingers after the decision is made. Aligned choices feel different. They are not always easy, but they feel clean. There is no internal argument afterward, just acceptance. As I listened more, I noticed how many commitments in my life were based on momentum, not intention. I had agreed to things because they made sense at the time, not because they still did. Changing that wasn't simple. It required honesty. And honesty, when practiced gently, still carries weight. I didn't suddenly cancel everything. I didn't withdraw from life. I adjusted. I started saying, "Let me think about that. I'm not sure I can commit right now. I need more time." These phrases felt radical, not because they were bold, but because they disrupted expectation. The expectation that availability is automatic. That saying yes is the default. But saying yes when you mean no creates quiet resentment. Resentment erodes gentleness. I wanted to live without that erosion. Listening to myself didn't make me selfish. It made me accurate. Accuracy allowed me to show up more honestly. When I did say yes, I meant it. When I was present, I was actually there. This changed how conversations felt. I listened differently, not waiting to respond, not planning my words while the other person spoke, just listening. It sounds simple, but it requires restraint. Restraint from filling space, restraint from proving understanding, restraint from redirecting the focus. Listening deeply creates intimacy, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that settles in the body. People responded to that. They slowed down, too. Conversations felt less transactional, more human. I realized then that gentleness is contagious. When you move slowly, others feel permission to do the same. Not everyone, not always, but often enough to notice. This realization softened me. It removed the pressure to change the world or fix anyone. Gentleness doesn't fix. It accompanies. It says, "I am here with you," without needing to improve the moment. As my life slowed internally, I became more sensitive to environments. Some spaces felt nourishing, others felt draining. Not because of what happened there, but because of how they moved. The pace, the tone, the expectations. I stopped forcing myself to adapt everywhere. I chose environments that allowed breathing room. That choice was not always convenient, but it was respectful. Respecting your nervous system is an act of care. I learned that exhaustion is not always physical. Sometimes it comes from constant self-monitoring, from adjusting yourself to fit spaces that do not honor your rhythm. When I allowed myself to have a rhythm, life felt less adversarial, less like something to endure, more like something to inhabit. This didn't mean everything became calm. There were still deadlines, still responsibilities, still difficult conversations, but my relationship to them changed. I didn't brace myself as much. I entered situations with more internal support. Listening to myself gave me a sense of companionship. I was no longer alone inside my own head. That companionship made challenges feel more navigable. I wasn't fighting myself on top of everything else. That alone saved enormous energy. Energy that I could now use to be attentive, to be kind, to be thoughtful. Gentleness, I discovered, is not passive. It is attentive engagement without force. It requires strength to remain open without hardening, to listen without defending, to move without rushing. These qualities are rarely celebrated, but they change the texture of life. They give days a sense of fullness, even when nothing remarkable happens. As this way of living settled further, I noticed something unexpected. Joy returned. Not the loud kind, not the celebratory kind. A quiet joy. The kind that appears in ordinary moments, in making tea, in walking without headphones, in noticing the sky without photographing it. These moments didn't demand attention. They offered it. I accepted. And in accepting, I felt rooted. Rootedness is rare in a culture of constant movement, but it is deeply stabilizing. It gives you a place to return to when everything else feels uncertain. That place is not a location. It is a way of being with yourself. Listening became that place for me, a practice, but also a refuge. And from that refuge, life felt less overwhelming. Not because it was easier, but because I was present for it. Presence, I learned, is the foundation of gentle living. Without it, everything feels rushed. With it, even difficulty has room to breathe. As presence deepened, I began to notice something else. Listening to myself did not separate me from the world. It changed how I moved within it. I had assumed that slowing down internally would make me less capable, less responsive, less effective. The opposite happened. So I became more precise. When you are no longer rushing inside, you see what actually matters. You stop reacting to everything. You start responding to what is essential. This clarity revealed how much of my energy had been spent on unnecessary tension. Tension from trying to be understood too quickly. Tension from managing impressions. Tension from anticipating reactions before they ever occurred. All of that tension had felt like responsibility, but it wasn't. It was control disguised as care. I began letting conversations unfold without steering them. If someone misunderstood me, I allowed the misunderstanding to exist a little longer. If silence appeared, I didn't rush to fill it. At first, this felt risky. Silence had always felt like failure. Misunderstanding had felt like danger. But something surprising happened. Most of the time, nothing bad followed. Sometimes, clarity emerged naturally. Sometimes, it didn't. And life continued. This taught me that not every moment needs immediate correction. Gentleness allows incompleteness. You don't have to resolve everything right away. You can let moments remain unfinished. Unfinished does not mean broken, it means alive. This perspective softened how I related to people. I stopped trying to arrive at mutual understanding as quickly as possible. I allowed differences to exist without rushing toward agreement. Not all differences need to be reconciled. Some simply need space. This reduced friction. Conversations felt less like negotiations and more like explorations. I wasn't trying to get somewhere. I was staying with what was happening. Staying became a recurring theme. Staying with discomfort, staying with uncertainty, staying with feelings that didn't have names yet. Previously, I had rushed past these states in search of resolution. Resolution felt productive. But resolution without understanding is shallow. It doesn't hold. By staying, I began to notice patterns. How certain situations triggered familiar reactions. How some emotions were not about the present moment, but echoes of earlier experiences. Listening allowed differentiation. I could separate what was actually happening from what my body remembered. This distinction was quietly liberating. It meant I didn't have to respond to every feeling as if it were urgent truth. I could observe. Observation creates choice. Choice creates freedom. Gentleness, I learned, is deeply connected to freedom. Not the freedom of escape, but the freedom of response. When you are gentle with yourself, you stop forcing immediate clarity. You allow things to reveal themselves in their own time. This patience changed how I related to emotions. I stopped categorizing them as good or bad. I treated them as information. Sadness told me where something mattered. Irritation told me where a boundary was needed. Fatigue told me where I had overextended. None of these emotions required elimination. They required attention. Attention, given consistently, transforms emotional intensity into emotional intelligence. I became less afraid of feeling. Feeling no longer meant losing control. It meant gaining insight. This insight extended into how I related to my past. I stopped trying to reinterpret it into something inspirational. I allowed it to be what it was: complex, uneven, incomplete. Not every experience needs to be redeemed. Some simply need to be acknowledged. Acknowledgement restores dignity, especially to parts of yourself that were ignored because they didn't fit who you were trying to become. Gentleness welcomed those parts back, not to dominate, but to belong. Belonging, internally, changed everything externally. I no longer needed to prove coherence to feel whole. Wholeness emerged from allowing contradiction. I could be strong and tired, clear and uncertain, committed and hesitant. These states no longer canceled each other. They coexisted. This coexistence felt honest. Honesty reduced internal friction. With less friction, energy became available. Not the restless energy of urgency, but a steady energy of presence. I noticed how this energy affected my days. Key tasks no longer felt like burdens to get through. They became sequences of attention. I wasn't rushing toward completion. I was engaging with process. This did not make me slower. It made me steadier. Steadiness is often mistaken for stagnation, but steadiness is what allows movement without collapse. I could work longer without feeling drained, rest deeper without guilt. Rest, when chosen consciously, felt restorative, not like escape. This was new. Before, rest had been something I earned after exhaustion. Now it became something I integrated. Gentleness redefined rest as maintenance, not reward. Maintaining myself felt like a responsibility, not an indulgence. This reframing reduced burnout. Burnout thrives on neglect. Gentleness interrupts it by paying attention early. I started noticing the first signs of overload, the subtle ones: irritability, mental fog, a sense of resistance toward things I usually enjoyed. Instead of pushing through, I paused. Not dramatically, just enough to recalibrate. This prevented spirals. Small pauses prevent large collapses. Gentleness favors prevention over recovery. This approach extended to how I made decisions. I stopped forcing certainty. I allowed decisions to emerge gradually. Sometimes the answer arrived through repetition. If a question returned again and again, it was asking to be addressed. If it faded, it didn't need forcing. This listening-based decision-making felt unfamiliar, but it felt right. I trusted it. Trust, once rebuilt internally, spilled outward. I trusted myself to handle outcomes. This reduced anxiety. Anxiety often comes from mistrust. Mistrust in your capacity to respond. Gentleness rebuilt that trust. I didn't need to predict everything. I needed to remain present enough to respond well. Presence replaced control. This shift changed how I related to uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer felt like a threat. It felt like space. Space for adaptation. Space for learning. Space for surprise. Surprise, when not feared, brings aliveness. I noticed myself becoming more open to unplanned moments. A conversation that went somewhere unexpected. An idea that arrived uninvited. A change in direction that felt right. Gentleness made room for these deviations. Previously, I would have resisted them in favor of plans. Plans felt safe, but plans can become cages if held too tightly. Gentleness loosened my grip, said not everything needed to be anticipated. Life could participate. This participation felt like collaboration. I was no longer managing life. I was engaging with it. Engagement felt richer. Even mundane moments carried texture. I noticed the weight of objects, the rhythm of walking, the tone of my own thoughts. These details grounded me. Grounding reduced dissociation. I was no longer floating above my life. I was inside it, inside my body, inside my choices, inside my time. Time itself felt different. It expanded, not because there was more of it, but because I was present for it. Presence stretches experience. A short walk could feel complete. A simple meal could feel satisfying. Nothing extraordinary happened. And that was the point. Gentleness revealed that ordinary life is not empty. It is full when inhabited. This realization changed what I wanted. I stopped chasing intensity. I wanted continuity, a life I could stay with, a pace I could maintain, a way of being that didn't require constant recovery. Gentleness offered that, not as a technique, but as a relationship with myself, a relationship based on listening, respect, and patience. Patience, I learned, is not waiting. It is staying present without forcing outcome, and staying became my practice. Staying with moments, staying with people, staying with myself, not indefinitely, but honestly. This honesty felt like the beginning of something durable, not a transformation, but a return. A return to inhabiting my life instead of rushing through it. And once I tasted that, there was no desire to go back. There was a moment when I realized that gentleness was no longer something I practiced only inwardly. It had started to shape how I met the world, not through grand changes, not through declarations, but through small, almost invisible shifts in how I showed up. I noticed it first in how I listened to others. I no longer listened to prepare a response. I listened to understand the shape of what was being said. This sounds simple, but it changes everything. When you are not preparing to speak, your body relaxes. Your attention widens. You begin to hear what lies between words, the hesitations, the pauses, the emotions that do not announce themselves. I realized how often, in the past, I had interrupted people internally. Even when I stayed silent, my mind was busy correcting, organizing, or planning. Gentleness quieted that impulse. It allowed me to stay, and staying created connection. People responded differently when they felt unrushed. They spoke more slowly, more honestly. Sometimes they discovered what they were trying to say while saying it. I didn't need to guide that process. My presence was enough. This taught me that support does not always look like advice. Often it looks like attention. Attention that does not demand progress. Attention that does not evaluate. Just attention. This shifted how relationships felt. They became less transactional, less about exchange, more about sharing space. I stopped measuring conversations by outcomes. Did we resolve something? Did we reach clarity? Did we agree? Instead, I measured them by resonance. Did we feel seen? Did something soften? Did we leave the conversation with more space inside than before? These questions changed what I considered meaningful. I also noticed how gentleness affected conflict. Previously, conflict had felt like something to win or avoid. Both options required armor. Gentleness invited something else: curiosity. When disagreement arose, I tried staying with the discomfort instead of rushing to defend. This was not easy. My body still reacted. Tension still appeared. But I learned to pause before acting on it. That pause created a gap. And in that gap, I could choose response instead of reaction. I asked myself, what is actually being threatened here? Often, the answer was not safety, but identity. The need to be right, the need to be understood, the fear of being diminished. Seeing this clearly reduced the intensity. I could respond without escalating. Sometimes that meant acknowledging the other person's experience without agreeing. Sometimes it meant naming my own feelings without blaming. And sometimes it meant choosing silence, not as withdrawal, but as respect. Silence can be an offering. It gives the moment room to breathe. This approach did not eliminate conflict, but it transformed it. Conflict became informative instead of destructive. It revealed values, boundaries, unspoken expectations. Gentleness allowed these revelations without turning them into battles. I noticed something else. As I became gentler, I became more honest. Not harsher, not blunt, honest. I stopped saying yes when my body said no. I stopped agreeing to things that drained me out of politeness. This honesty was quiet. It did not need justification. I learned to say, I can't commit to that right now, and let it be enough. At first, this felt selfish, but I noticed how much resentment disappeared when I respected my limits. Resentment thrives where honesty is withheld. Gentleness supported truth by making it safe. Safe to say no. Safe to change my mind. Safe to admit uncertainty. I realized how much energy I had spent maintaining consistency for others. Gentleness allowed flexibility. I could evolve without apology. This was especially important in how I related to time. I stopped forcing productivity into every moment. I allowed unstructured space, not to optimize it, not to monetize it, just to exist. These moments felt awkward at first. Without tasks, my mind searched for purpose, but gradually something else emerged. Spontaneity. Say ideas surfaced without pressure. Insights arrived without pursuit. Gentleness revealed that creativity does not respond well to force. It responds to invitation. I noticed this in my work. When I approached tasks with patience, they unfolded more smoothly. I made fewer mistakes. I noticed details sooner. Efficiency improved, not because I rushed, but because I was present. This challenged everything I had learned about effort. I had believed that intensity equaled commitment, but gentleness showed me that sustainability requires care. Care for attention, care for energy, care for rhythm. Rhythm became important. I began honoring natural cycles, periods of focus, periods of rest, periods of reflection. I stopped expecting myself to be consistent every day. Consistency over time does not require uniformity. It requires responsiveness, listening to when to push and when to pause. Gentleness sharpened this listening. It made me sensitive to subtle shifts. When focus faded, I rested. When curiosity returned, I followed it. This reduced resistance. Life felt less like effort and more like flow, not constant flow, but honest movement. I also noticed how gentleness affected my inner dialogue. The voice inside became less critical, not silent, but kinder. When I made mistakes, I no longer attacked myself. I asked, "What can I learn here?" This question changed everything. Learning replaced punishment. Mistakes became information instead of evidence of failure. This allowed experimentation. I tried things without guaranteeing success. I took small risks without catastrophic thinking. Gentleness created psychological safety. Safety encourages growth. This growth was not dramatic, it was incremental, but it was real. I felt more grounded, more stable, more myself. And myself no longer meant a fixed identity. It meant a relationship with my needs, my values, my changing capacities. Gentleness maintained that relationship. It reminded me to check in. How am I today? What do I need? What can I offer? These questions guided decisions, not external expectations, not imagined standards. This alignment reduced inner conflict. When actions matched values, peace followed. Not excitement, peace. A calm sense that I was where I needed to be. This peace extended outward. People around me felt it. They responded with openness, with trust. Not because I tried to create that response, but because presence is contagious. Gentleness invites gentleness. I saw this most clearly in moments of vulnerability. When I shared uncertainty, others shared theirs. When I admitted fatigue, others felt permission to rest. This mutual softening deepened connection. It reminded me that strength does not come from hardness. It comes from honesty held with care. I also learned that gentleness includes boundaries. It is not endless giving. It is discernment. Knowing when to engage and when to step back. Knowing when to listen and when to protect silence. This discernment requires self-trust, and self-trust grows when you honor your limits. Gentleness and boundaries are not opposites. They support each other. Without boundaries, gentleness becomes depletion. Without gentleness, boundaries become walls. Together, they create integrity. Integrity feels whole. Whole does not mean perfect. It means coherent. Your inner experience matches your outer life. This coherence reduced anxiety. I no longer felt split between who I was and who I presented. Presentation softened. I showed up as I was. This authenticity simplified life. There was less to maintain, less to explain. I could be present instead of performing. Performance is exhausting. Presence is sustainable. This sustainability changed how I imagined the future. I stopped chasing ideal versions of myself. I focused on continuity. Could I live this way for years? That became my metric. If a choice required constant self-betrayal, it wasn't viable. Gentleness favored longevity, a life that could be inhabited without collapse. This perspective removed urgency. I did not need to arrive. I needed to remain. Remain attentive. Remain honest. Remain responsive. This is what gentleness taught me. Not how to escape difficulty, but how to stay with life without breaking. And once that became clear, everything else felt negotiable. Except this. I would no longer abandon myself for speed, approval, or certainty. I would stay. And that decision, quiet and unremarkable, became the most stable ground I had ever known. There is a quieter layer of gentleness that only reveals itself over time. It appears after the obvious changes, after the calmer reactions, after the softened inner voice. It is the gentleness that reshapes how you relate to meaning itself. I noticed this when my urge to explain my life began to fade. I no longer felt the need to package experiences into lessons quickly. I let them remain raw, unfinished, unlabeled. Before, I had rushed to understand everything. Why did this happen? What does it mean? How do I use it? Gentleness slowed that impulse. It taught me that some experiences need to be lived longer before they can be understood. Meaning ripens. It cannot be forced. This was uncomfortable at first. Without interpretation, events felt ambiguous. Ambiguity used to frighten me. It felt like standing without ground. But over time, I discovered something unexpected. Ambiguity is spacious. It allows multiple truths to coexist. I did not need a single narrative to justify my choices. I could allow my life to be layered, contradictory even. Gentleness made room for complexity. This changed how I viewed growth. Growth was no longer about becoming better. It was about becoming truer. Truer to my limits, and truer to my desires, truer to my actual capacity. This truth was not always flattering. Sometimes it meant admitting that I could not sustain what I once admired. Sometimes it meant letting go of identities that impressed others but exhausted me. Letting go felt like loss, but gentleness reframed loss as release. I was not shrinking, I was refining. Refinement reduces noise. With less noise, intuition became clearer. I could sense when something aligned and when it didn't. Not intellectually, somatically. My body responded before my thoughts. A tightening, a heaviness, or a quiet ease. I began trusting these signals. They were subtle, but consistent. Gentleness sharpened perception. It made me attentive to the language of my body. Before, I treated the body as something to manage. Now it became a collaborator. Fatigue was not weakness. It was information. Tension was not failure. It was feedback. This partnership changed how I cared for myself. Care became responsive instead of prescriptive. I stopped following rigid routines that ignored how I actually felt. I chose flexibility. Some days required movement. Some days required stillness. Gentleness allowed both. This flexibility extended to my emotional life. I stopped trying to maintain a constant mood. I allowed emotional weather. Some days were heavy, some were light. Neither needed fixing. I learned to ask, what does this day require? Not, how do I override this state? This reduced inner resistance. Resistance had been exhausting. Gentleness conserved energy by removing unnecessary struggle. With more energy available, I became more generous. Not from obligation, but from abundance. I could listen longer, offer help without resentment, be present without counting the cost. This generosity did not deplete me, because it was chosen. Choice is essential. Without choice, giving becomes sacrifice. Gentleness restored agency. Agency allowed me to say no without guilt and yes without fear. This balance felt mature. Not idealistic, not hardened, just grounded. I also noticed how gentleness changed my relationship with ambition. Ambition used to feel urgent, like a race against time. Gentleness slowed ambition into intention. I still cared. I still wanted to create, to contribute, to grow. But I no longer needed everything to happen now. Time stopped feeling like an enemy. I began thinking in longer arcs. What could I build over years, not months? What kind of life could support that? So these questions shifted priorities. Sustainability replaced speed. I chose paths that allowed recovery. I stopped glorifying overextension. Burnout lost its allure. Gentleness exposed how normalized exhaustion had become, and how unnecessary. I did not need to be depleted to be valuable. This realization was quietly radical. It changed how I evaluated success. Success was no longer about visibility. It was about coherence. Did my life make sense to my nervous system? Could I rest at night without bracing for tomorrow? These became markers. When coherence was present, progress followed naturally. When it wasn't, no achievement compensated. Gentleness protected coherence. It kept me aligned. Alignment created ease. Not ease as comfort, but ease as lack of internal opposition. I was no longer fighting myself. This absence of conflict felt spacious. In that space, curiosity returned. I became interested again, in people, in ideas, in ordinary moments. Interest is a sign of health. When curiosity disappears, something is overloaded. Gentleness restored curiosity by reducing pressure. Pressure suffocates wonder. I allowed myself to not know, to ask questions without rushing to answer them, to explore without extracting value. This playfulness felt unfamiliar, almost indulgent, but it brought vitality. Vitality is subtle. It does not shout. It hums. I noticed it in small pleasures. Morning light, the sound of footsteps, the rhythm of breathing, gentleness, heightened sensitivity. Life felt textured, not dramatic, but rich. I no longer needed high stimulation to feel alive. This reduced dependency on constant novelty. Now I could stay. Staying became my quiet achievement. Staying with projects past initial excitement. Staying with relationships through discomfort. Staying with myself through doubt. Gentleness made staying possible because it removed punishment. I was no longer harsh when motivation fluctuated. I did not threaten myself with failure narratives. I adjusted. Adjustment replaced judgment. This adaptability was powerful. I could pivot without collapsing. I could pause without losing momentum. Momentum became cumulative, not explosive. Small steps, taken consistently, created stability. Stability is underrated, but stability supports depth. Depth allows meaning. Meaning, I learned, is not something you find. It is something that accumulates when you live in alignment. Gentleness supports that accumulation. It prevents erosion. I also noticed how gentleness influenced how I ended things. Projects, relationships, phases. I stopped forcing clean endings. Some things faded, some loosened, some transformed. I allowed transitions to be gradual. This reduced grief, not because loss disappeared, but because it was integrated. Gentleness honors endings without dramatizing them. It allows appreciation without attachment. This maturity felt peaceful. Peaceful does not mean passive. It means settled. I was no longer chasing resolution. I was inhabiting process. Process has no final chapter. It unfolds. Gentleness taught me to respect that, to stop asking, "When will I arrive?" and start asking, "How am I moving?" This shift changed everything. Life stopped feeling like a test. It felt like a relationship, one that required attention, honesty, and care. Gentleness became the tone of that relationship, not softness without strength, but strength without violence. I could face difficulty without hardening. I could protect myself without closing. This balance felt like adulthood, not defined by age, but by integration. I was integrated, not finished, but present. And presence, I realized, was the quiet foundation beneath everything I had been seeking. Not clarity, not certainty, not control, presence. Gentleness was simply the way I learned to stay there. There is a point where gentleness stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a baseline, not something you reach for when things are hard, but the ground you stand on no matter what is happening. I noticed this when difficult moments no longer felt like interruptions. They felt included, included in life, included in growth, included in who I was becoming. Before, difficulty always came with resistance. Why this again? Why now? Why me? Gentleness softened those questions, not by answering them, but by dissolving the urgency behind them. Difficulty became part of the rhythm, like weather, sometimes heavy, sometimes clear, always moving. I no longer needed to argue with it. This acceptance was not resignation, it was orientation. I oriented myself toward response instead of reaction. Response requires presence, and presence had become familiar. I trusted it. This trust changed how I experienced fear. Fear did not disappear, but it stopped dominating. I could feel fear without obeying it, whilst I could acknowledge it without amplifying it. Gentleness taught me that fear often wants reassurance, not suppression. So I learned to sit with it, to ask, "What are you protecting?" Often, fear was guarding something tender, a value, a hope, a sense of belonging. Seeing this made fear less hostile. It became a signal, not an enemy. This reframing reduced inner conflict. I stopped fighting parts of myself. Integration replaced control. Integration feels calm, not numb, not detached. Calm in the sense that nothing inside is being exiled. This internal hospitality changed how I handled mistakes. Mistakes no longer triggered collapse. They triggered reflection. I asked, what did this reveal? About my limits, my assumptions, my timing. Mistakes became mirrors. And mirrors, when approached gently, teach without shaming. This learning was durable. I did not repeat the same patterns as often, not because I forced change, but because awareness lingered. Gentleness deepened learning by removing fear from this process. Fear shortens attention. Gentleness extends it. With extended attention, patterns became visible. I noticed cycles in my energy, my motivation, my social needs. I stopped expecting linear progress. Life is cyclical. Gentleness honors cycles. It does not punish downturns. It prepares for them. This preparation was subtle. I learned to rest before exhaustion, to simplify before overwhelm, to speak before resentment built. These small adjustments prevented larger disruptions. Gentleness made prevention possible because it encouraged listening early. I also noticed how gentleness affected my sense of identity. I stopped defining myself by roles. Not the productive one, not the strong one, not the thoughtful one. Roles are narrow. Gentleness allowed multiplicity. I could be different in different contexts without feeling inconsistent. This flexibility felt freeing. Identity became fluid, but not unstable. It was anchored in values, not performance. Values remain even when circumstances change. Gentleness clarified my values because it removed noise. I could feel what mattered without defending it. This clarity simplified decisions. I did not need elaborate reasoning. If something violated my values, my body responded. If something aligned, there was ease. I trusted this ease. Ease does not mean lack of effort. It means absence of inner resistance. This distinction changed how I evaluated effort. I could work hard without feeling strained. Strain comes from misalignment, not exertion. Gentleness reduced strain by keeping effort honest. Honesty with myself became non-negotiable. Not brutal honesty, gentle honesty, naming limits, acknowledging desire, admitting uncertainty. This honesty kept me grounded. Grounded people do not need constant validation. they feel rooted. Rootedness changed how I experienced solitude. Solitude was no longer loneliness, it was replenishment. I enjoyed my own presence, not because I was exceptional, but because I was familiar. Gentleness made me familiar to myself. This familiarity reduced the need to escape. I could sit without distraction. I could be without narrating. Silence felt companionable. This was new. Before, silence felt empty. Now, it felt spacious. See, space allowed integration. Thoughts settled. Emotions softened. Insights surfaced quietly. Nothing dramatic, just clarity. Clarity that arrived without effort. I noticed how this clarity influenced communication. I spoke more slowly, not because I was careful, but because I was connected to what I was saying. Words felt deliberate. I did not over-explain. I trusted silence to carry meaning. This confidence did not come from certainty. It came from alignment. When you are aligned, you do not need to convince. This reduced interpersonal tension. I was less defensive, less reactive. I could hear feedback without collapsing. I could disagree without hostility. Gentleness stabilized my sense of self. Stability allowed openness. I was not threatened by difference. Difference became interesting. Curiosity replaced judgment. Judgment requires distance. Curiosity requires presence. Gentleness keeps you present. I also noticed how gentleness influenced how I imagined the future. The future stopped being a place I needed to secure. It became a direction I was walking toward, step by step. I did not need guarantees. I needed adaptability. Gentleness increased adaptability by keeping me responsive. I could adjust plans without feeling like I failed. Plans became guides, not contracts. This flexibility reduced pressure. Pressure had been narrowing my life. Gentleness widened it, not by adding more, but by allowing depth. Depth in conversations. Depth in work. Depth in rest. Depth requires time. Gentleness respects time. It does not rush outcomes. It trusts process. This trust felt like faith, not in outcomes, but in capacity. My capacity to respond, to learn, to recover. This faith was earned through experience. Gentleness had proven itself. It had carried me through confusion, through fatigue, through change. Not by removing difficulty, but by making it survivable without hardening. Hardening narrows life. Gentleness preserves openness. I chose openness, again and again. Not because it was easy, but because it was sustainable. Sustainability became my quiet standard. If a way of living required me to abandon myself, it was not viable. Gentleness ensured I stayed. Stayed in my body, stayed in my values, stayed in my life. This staying felt like commitment, not dramatic, not loud, but consistent. And consistency, held gently, became strength. A strength that did not dominate, did not rush, did not demand. It endured. That endurance was the final lesson. Gentleness is not fragile. It is what allows you to remain intact over time, to meet life fully without being consumed by it, to grow without breaking. And once you understand that, gentleness is no longer optional. It becomes the way you walk forward. Quietly, attentively, still here.